This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to tonight's Storyworks Roundtable. We are super excited to be joined by Mike Stop Continues. Mike is a cross-genre writer. He writes literary fiction, YA, and superhero, probably some other genres as well, like so many of us. He's got the standalone literary YA novel Underworld out, as well as the King Cage superhero series. And the reason we're having Mike on with us tonight is because recently we put out an episode on foreshadowing that went a little awry. Because it turned out we didn't establish a definition of foreshadowing before we started the conversation. And then we couldn't quite agree on a conversation. So much of the episode, or definition, so much of our conversation was trying to sort out our definition of foreshadowing and how it plays out in fiction. And so Mike is a great listener of the show, and he actually came to our Facebook page and gave us his definition of foreshadowing, as well as some wonderful examples. And we said, hey, let's have that guy on the show, and let's do the foreshadowing Redux here.
So moral of the story, come hang out with us on Facebook.
That's right. That is the Storyworks Writers Facebook group, and we do check it whenever anything is posted, and we do respond, and we encourage conversations there. So
it's a guaranteed path to fame.
Guaranteed. Well, it might get you on our show.
I'm so ready for my 15 minutes.
That's right. Starting now. Yes. All right. So let's start this episode by defining foreshadowing. And this was interesting because I went to 3 of my huge craft books from my MFA days, and none of them have foreshadowing in the index. So I'm sure foreshadowing is mentioned somewhere in the midst of some discussion in these 3 craft books, but apparently it's not important enough to get a listing in the index. So I thought that was telling.
That's encouraging, yeah.
Yes. And then I went to the internet, of course, and found a lot of similar definitions, but nothing that I found particularly satisfying or compelling. One definition is that foreshadowing is a literary device in which the author gives clues about events that will happen later in the story. Often these clues are fairly subtle so that they can only be noticed or fully understood upon a second reading. Foreshadowing can come in the form of descriptive detail, bits of dialogue, even in the names of characters. So that's from literarydevices.com. And what I like about that one that a lot of other definitions didn't get at is the subtlety of foreshadowing, and that it's really something easy to gloss over. And you notice it in hindsight when you've seen that foreshadowing come to fruition. So there you go. We've got a working definition of foreshadowing. Do you guys want to chime in on the definition before we go any deeper?
Actually, for what it's worth as well, that's literary devices. I've got a .net, but maybe it's the same as .com. That was the place I arrived at eventually as well, after finding some less than satisfactory definitions. And yeah, I thought it was nice. It boiled it down quite simply.
Mm-hmm.
What I like about the definition is that it points to the fact that it's the author communicating with the reader. Because I think that the thing that is special about foreshadowing is that it's for me at least, it's always subtext. It's always something that it's always through the book that the reader is hinting at what's to come, rather than something that's happening in the world of the characters. Even if we use the world of the characters, the action or dialogue or description to give that clue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Catherine?
So far we're all in agreement.
Definition? Anything you want to add there?
No, I think it's hilarious because I found the same website. And I also had that bookmarked.
Excellent.
But yeah, I mean, yeah. And I like part of the definition that I found, I, again, conglomerating a number of different definitions, was it talks about how it creates an atmosphere of suspense, which I think, Alita, you were talking about in the previous episode, the idea of tension.
Right.
And so, like, even if you don't know exactly why you're feeling the tension, that atmosphere of suspense in foreshadowing. And I think sometimes the less subtle, the more suspenseful. But that kind of gave me a little bit more something to sink my teeth into. Like, what is it actually doing to the story?
Right, because if it's so subtle that you don't notice it at all, then it's not going to create tension. So you want it to be subtle enough that, you know, it's not obvious what's going to happen down the road, but significant enough so that readers do take note of it. So did everyone bring in examples? Awesome.
That's the only issue I have, is you say significant enough that readers take note of it, and I don't believe that has to be the case, because I do believe that there can be a subtext that you don't necessarily always pay attention to as a reader. So I like what Mike said, that it's an author's deliberation in communicating with the reader, and my view on that is you can communicate quite overtly, but you can also communicate covertly. And that may be picked up on a second or third read, perhaps.
Right. But if you don't notice it at all, then there's no tension created. So subtle, yes. Invisible, no, is what I would say. You know, it's a very
that's where we
fine line
disagree.
there. Yeah.
If you don't notice it consciously, doesn't mean that it doesn't go in. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we pay attention to consciously, but then there's an awful lot of things happening around us all the time that add to atmosphere and experience. So I think even subtle things like description, or even as that particular site said, you know, it can be names of books or names of characters. You know, if you pick up a book that says Conan the Barbarian, you kind of expect that it's not about fairy godmothers, you know, so... But you don't necessarily stop and think, oh, Conan the Barbarian, you know. I wanted a book about barbarians. Damn things about fairy godmothers.
Right. But the barbarian isn't foreshadowing. That's just telling it like it is. I mean, that's very obvious. You know, there's no subtlety there. I don't think so.
No, it's not subtle. It's not subtle foreshadowing.
Calling it out with a keyword. That's search engine optimization. It's Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah, we disagree. I think things like, for example, the title of one of my books, Constellation, is a dead giveaway that this is clearly something to do with space. It happens to be the name of a spaceship, but it's something to do with space. So there's foreshadowing, and it's very overt. I mean, it's not. I agree with you. It's highly telegraphed. Anyway, I'll back off and and just flag that, you know, I think there's something subtle in there that is very, very subtle.
Okay. I mean, I'm just still going to disagree with that, because it's just not foreshadowing if it's not subtle. Like the murder in Skog Hall isn't foreshadowing that there was a murder in Skog Hall. It's telling you there was a murder in Skog Hall. There's no like shadow there. It's a bright spotlight saying this is what it is.
But definition is it's a hint of what's to come. So if you don't deliver on that from the title, then you haven't played through on the foreshadowing.
Right. Well, that would be misleading. That would be misrepresentation.
Yeah. But it's a form of foreshadowing, that's all.
All right. We're going to turn this into a conversation on the art of subtlety here. But Mike and Catherine, what would you like to say?
So I came up with one example that I feel like was on the border, and and maybe the reason that it was on the border for me is that I only have the movie as reference. Fight Club. There's a big twist at the end of Fight Club, and it's a twist for the character. So in that sense, the character receives a series of clues that lead to his discovery that he's a split personality. But for the viewer, do the clues that we get count towards foreshadowing the ending for us? So, for instance, the scene where Tyler Durden and then the main character are sitting in the hospital, and the sort of narration says, "I was just looking for it." The narration says, Tyler Durden says, "I fell down some stairs," and then the narrator, the POV character repeats, "I fell down some stairs," as an excuse to for why he looks so beat up. Now that's a strange line because it suggests like history of abuse sort of thing, and so it calls the line itself into question as much as it calls the words, the fact that the words are repeated into question. So is that foreshadowing, or is that just a clue? Is that just part of the story itself?
I would say that is foreshadowing. I would think that counts. There's a definite example of that, which I used in POV when I was talking about the twist. Because he opens the book by telling us that you see two people. You see one person talking to himself, but I see two people at the beginning, at the very opening scene of that book. And so that would be foreshadowing the fact that he's got a split personality. So that is the foreshadowing. And then all those things, like the example you gave, Mike, are the clues that show us how this thing is playing out, in which the reader or viewer would see him as one person talking to himself, but he sees two people talking to himself.
Right.
So the opening text is actually the foreshooting, and the other things are the clues that build up to the twist. So I would have to look too hard to find that.
It's a great example of a novel where too much foreshadowing would just completely ruin it, because the twist is quite spectacular. So if it comes completely out of nowhere at the end, you go, "Oh, well, duh, thanks for that. You never gave me any hint." But I mean, I read the book after watching the movie, some time apart, but the book I found quite exhausting. It was fantastic, a really wild ride. And for it to do that, and even though I knew from having seen the movie, I still knew the twist. It's clever writing that the author can do that.
Right. Well, and I think this is a really interesting example, because if you read the opening passage, he tells you very specifically, you see one person talking to himself. Yeah. I see me having a conversation with somebody completely different from me. But you get so caught up in the story that you kind of forget that. And then you get to the twist, and it's like, oh, there's the hindsight part where you connect the dots and see how the twist was foreshadowed. But because you're so eager to go on this ride, you let it disappear from your memory. You go with the narrator through the chronological story, because that opening is actually jumping in time. It's a framing device. Yeah. So when he tells you that, it's after he has experienced the reveal, but before you have started the journey with him.
You actually raise a really interesting question as to if foreshadowing requires hindsight. Does foreshadowing only work if you remember it in hindsight, if there's some connection, or is it enough that it's there? Do you know what I mean? I get that. Does it have to be visible enough that you remember it when the foreshadowing is revealed as foreshadowing, or let's say, let's say in the Fight Club reference, the first line, you never remember the first line, you never go back to it, you never see the clues, you just say, oh, this is is it still foreshadowing? Or does foreshadowing require some? Yeah, okay.
It is, because as the author, you put it in that piece in order to foreshadow it. So whether a reader picks up on it or not, you can't control that. And ideally, a reader will either remember it or read the book a second time and go, oh, right, there it is. But we don't know what someone's going to notice or remember. So yes, it exists as foreshadowing, whether someone notices or not.
It comes back to your definition you gave us to start there, Mike, about the author, making a deliberate play. We're kind of saying, well, whether the reader notices it or not, it's still the author making a deliberate play that adds something to the story and the way the story may or may not unfold if it's a red herring. Foreshadowing. In which case, is it foreshadowing?
Right. Then it's just a red herring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and in that example, the Fight Club example, it raises a question for the reader, even if they don't understand why the answer is what the answer is. Like, the question is going to be there. What does he mean? One person, two people. And then, maybe you won't even realize you're answering the question with a twist until you think back on it. But that does at some point raise a question.
Yeah, and that question is what creates the tension in the reader, because it's that I need to discover something, that intrigue that compels us to go forward in the story.
Right.
Yeah. So here's another example from To Kill a Mockingbird. This is on page 54 of this copy. What Mr. Radley did was his own business. If he wanted to come out, he would. If he wanted to stay inside his own house, he had the right to stay inside, free from the attention of inquisitive children, which was a mild term for the likes of us. How would we like it if Atticus barged in on us without knocking when we were in our rooms at night? We were in effect doing the same thing to Mr. Radley. So, and then she goes on to talk about his peculiarities. But, of course, if you've read the book, you know that there's a ton of intrigue around Boo Radley, who is this shut-in. How come nobody has seen him? The kids become infatuated with him and try to kind of spy on him, play games about him, and then communicate with him. And there's subtle stuff with, like, notes in the tree outside his house. And at the very end, in the climax, he does come out of his house and he saves the children's lives. So this is foreshadowing. What he wants to do is his own business. He's got to choose. He's got to be the agent. He can't be drawn out. He's got to choose to come out if he wants to. And he's got a right to be free from these inquisitive children. But at the end of all this, the inquisitive children are the people who finally free him to make that choice to step outside. So this passage is telling you the kids should leave him alone and let him be what he is the way he is, but it's not case closed. It's foreshadowing the opposite. This dramatic twist when he takes that leap and comes outside.
Yeah.
So.
Excellent. It's good.
There's one example. Mike, you look like you want to say something. So I'm
I like that. I like that example because it's foreshadowing thematic elements more so than the literal elements of the story. And I think that you're right. What makes it so sharp is that it actually foreshadows a reversal. And it makes me wonder. I guess the most important question is, why should authors foreshadow anything, right? And right, because although so I think that example is points to the fact that in a good novel, everything is foreshadowing, right? Every single line has a little bit of some suggestion of what's going to happen, further along the novel, but most of the time at the end. But I guess my question is, why is that important? And why is it better to do that than not to do that?
Right. Well, I mean, it sets up that intrigue we were talking about that compels the reader forward. So without intrigue, without raising questions in the reader's mind that they want to have answered, we don't create a reason for the reader to keep turning pages. And it can also set up a twist, like in Fight Club and in To Kill a Mockingbird, where we've got that reversal of what's expected of this character. So it's set up. You can do it to surprise the reader. So not necessarily in a red herring way, but to create, when you create that surprise or that reversal of expectation, it's not unfounded. So you you can go back and say, no, see, I planted the foundation of this twist. It isn't out of character. Like here, early in the book, the kids are developing this infatuation with Boo Radley, and they're kind of playing games about him and making up stories. But as their infatuation grows, it becomes kinder, and they start checking that tree hollow and kind of, I think they leave him some notes and he leaves some presents or something for them. So it becomes a form of connection that he's been missing from his life for years that fuels their infatuation. So you can kind of follow that trail of events. And then when he does come out to save them, it's inevitable. It's not Deus Ex Machina. It's not unfounded.
This is something turning over in my brain, so I might be completely wrong. But it kind of feels like, to me, we're almost looking at giving answers before the questions have been fully formed. So like in these examples, there are answers within the text to what is going to happen, but the question may not have fully formed in the reader's mind yet. So they're given like this bit to hold on to that they know is going to mean something, but they may not even have the right question to ask yet.
Right.
So like in the To Kill a Mockingbird example, there's even that reference to the very personal intrusion of Atticus into the bedroom, right? And so it's the idea that there's going to be a personal connection to where there's this answer hidden in there to the question we don't even know yet,
right,
as readers. So I don't know.
I think, yeah, exactly. I think it's a great question you posed there, Mike. Why did we do it? You prompted some thinking for me that was much more global, and I even came to why do we get up in the morning? Why do we? And ultimately, it's because there's something. I think it's Fritz Perls who. A great psychologist who said that which is most undone is what drives us. And I think reading a book is ultimately that experience, isn't it? Because if you get to page 3 and you already know how it plays out, then why bother going on? And so the gift of a story is that you want to continue reading to find out what happens. And foreshadowing is a way of communicating that by opening lots of loops or posing lots of questions or throwing in some answers to which we don't have questions that make you want to continue reading, because you have to close those loops. You have to finish what's undone. And that's why we all want to get to the end of a story. And then when you get to the end, you think, I wish that had gone longer. It was so good. Because now it's done and you can't. And then maybe that's why you go back and reread sometimes, because you're looking for things that are still undone somewhere. And you think, how did that play out? I've got to go back and read that. I skipped that battle scene way too fast because it was really exciting. Now I've got to go back and read it. So I think it comes back to one of those fundamental questions as to why does story entertain us, and what does an author do to make that entertaining? So, yeah, thank you, Mike. It was very provocative. It was good.
Right. And at the end, you want your foreshadowing to be something that is very satisfying.
That works.
To the reader.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So like by the end you can say, yes, see how that went together.
Yeah, which is where Alida is berating me for being, you can't.
Berating?
Yeah, well, you did.
I do not berate.
Yeah, she does. She uses literary words like berate.
Oh, goodness.
No, but I mean, so whilst I would argue that a title is a form of foreshadowing, it's not subtle. And so I think we're probably all in agreement that when foreshadowing is done skillfully by an author, it becomes part of the story. It's not just something that suddenly stands out, which is why we also used that example before about Stephen King and the others who get away with the thing at the end of the chapter that says, but of course next week was to change everything. And it's a really lazy way of foreshadowing. But some authors seem to get away with it. And think, oh, wow, I can't wait to find out what happens next week now.
Right.
Right.
Okay. Random thought. I think, Mike, was it you that talked about the series of unfortunate events on the Facebook thread?
Yes, yeah.
See, that's something where I think the foreshadowing is right there. Like you see, it's the title of the chapter, but it creates so much intrigue as to how did that happen, or, what was the series of events that led up to that unfortunate event, that it's not super subtle. It tells you exactly what's coming, but it is I don't know, it's a different kind of foreshadowing, probably.
All right. I really like. I really like semantics and splitting hairs here, so I'm going to do it again. But I think the key in the definition of foreshadowing is subtlety. So if it's like the title or the chapter titles, then it's a hook, not foreshadowing. And Robert, you said when it's part of the story, and I was like, yes, when it's in the narrative text or the dialogue, when it's part of that flow that you're so engaged with that you absorb it, but you almost don't know you're absorbing it. That's very different than like the billboard of a title, you know? So I would call those hooks, and I would call something in the body of the text foreshadowing.
Interesting.
So, so whether or not it's in the text, and I do agree that I think foreshadowing is probably more in the text than not, but whether or not it is or it isn't, I think that the series of unfortunate events example points to the fact that that foreshadowing is there's like a not convention to it. There's a there's like flavors to it. So like so in series of unfortunate events books, you can get away with a different set of things, and just like in the example with the names, not in every book can you name a character what their fate is. You know what I mean?
Right.
And like I could think of like Thomas Pynchon, right? Every character is like named what they are, and it works in his books. But could could we do that in any of ours? Like, I think it really. I'm saying that because I think we all write realist fiction, but I think that that your genre and your reader base will affect what kind of foreshadowing works.
Right. I think that's a really good point, Mike. And going back to a series of unfortunate events, like while I would say a chapter title is a hook, if you're reading in the body and it says, the house sat over the lake of, a lake named with capital letters, lake of whatever those fish are called, lake of man-eating fish or something, then you say, oh, they're going to end up in that lake dealing with those fish. So that's a kind of very unsubtle foreshadowing, but it's there in the body and it's using a naming convention. And so, that's kind of where I would put the top of my slider on my spectrum of, is it foreshadowing or is it a billboard hooking you, is because of that genre thing and because of the fun of it and the reader expectations that you're pointing out. All right.
So
go ahead.
Go.
Okay. All right. So the other example I brought in is from The Great Gatsby. So this is about a third of the way through the book, and Nick is at Gatsby's party talking to him. And Gatsby says, "I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. "I'll tell you God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. "I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition." He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase "educated at Oxford," or swallowed it, or choked on it, as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. And then a little bit later, Gatsby shows him a medal from Montenegro, and then he shows him a photograph from Oxford, from his Oxford days. So Fitzgerald sets up this doubt in our mind that Gatsby is just a big liar and a player. But then a page later, oh, here's proof all those rumors are false, and Gatsby's really what he says he is. And of course, at the end of the book, there's that question you were talking about, Catherine, like we're getting the answer before we know the question. So there's all this setup. We find out that Gatsby really was a faker and a liar, and that his proof was false. But that conversation is foreshadowing the twist, as well as the proof. It just adds to the mystery of who Jay Gatsby is.
and without that little sleight of hand, then it would be a less rich story. So I think that's one of the things that I like about Foreshadowing is it does add depth. And as an author, it's worth going back in your revisions and looking at different ways that you can improve the reader's expectations of what may or may not be about to come.
Right. And we're on unsteady ground with Gatsby here because we want to love this great party thrower, but then, oh, well, he's a liar and a cheat. But, oh, no, look, he's really this nice guy and he's got proof of it. But then, so you're like, yes, no.
So we experience the same degree of uncertainty as the other characters do.
As Nick and, Right, and it becomes a mystery to unravel as we get to know Gatsby and go deeper into the story, which, isn't really a mystery, but that's part of the characterization of this man, is his deceit.
So I'd like to read from one of the ones that I brought to the group, because I think it's also in line with the sort of like dialogue foreshadowing, and that's in Romeo and Juliet. In the second act, Romeo says to Juliet, "My life were better ended by their hate than death prolonged, wanting of thy love." So Romeo is saying, "I would rather be dead than not having your love." That's something that completely foreshadows the ending of the book, where they both end up dead. And the thing I like about that line, and this might just be personal preference as far as foreshadowing goes, but I like that it sticks out. Like, why would Romeo say this to Juliet? Like, why would death be the thing that comes up when they're talking about, it's like their first conversation about love? Why would this be what he talks about? And so what's so strong about that, I think, is that as a reader, it sticks out a little bit, but only when you see the ending do you realize that thing that you were so sure was weird before now feels more like it belongs in the novel than it did in the play than it did at the beginning.
Right. I think that's a great example. Because when you read it, that's that subtlety where you can take something to be other than it is. Like, you can read it as a grand gesture of romantic devotion, but not take it literally. Because who really is going to die just because somebody dumps him, right?
Right.
It's just a grand gesture. We all say that kind of stuff, and then you get on with life. Right. And at the end, of course, there's that hindsight piece. And then you have to take it literally.
Yeah, so I like the way that when it's done well, it creates those moments.
Yes.
That's the really nice thing about it, isn't it?
Definitely.
The one I brought in is a very simple, straightforward, just clue. This is from Jim Butcher's Codex Alera series. It's the second book in the series, called Academ's Fury. Tavi gave her a sour look as they reached the bottom of the slope, where it intersected another hallway. Something while I turn the page. Something flickered in the corner of his vision, and he turned to his right, staring intently down the hall. "Tavi," Max asked, "what is it?" "I'm not sure," Tavi said. "I thought I saw a light down there." And then something else happens, and they go off in a completely other direction. And you actually don't find out for probably chapters later that there is goings on down in the deeps. But it's just a little tiny little, droplet that comes in there. And it happened to catch my attention because I was reading it just after we'd done that episode. And I saw that and I thought, oh, what's going to happen down there? And then it never did for quite a while. I thought, oh, you're keeping us... in the dark there, Jim, for a little while.
Right. Cool.
So yeah, just a straightforward hint of what's to come. Nothing particularly deep about it, but you do know that that's got to be resolved, because if it isn't, then you're left dissatisfied.
Right.
Well, again, that's the answer to a question we don't even know yet. The answer is they're down there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's down there?
That example points out that sometimes the foreshadowing comes from the way the characters interact with the thing. I was watching a TV show last night on Amazon called The Living and the Dead, and it's set in the 1890s. And there's this moment where these people are outside in a field, and you see a jet vapor trail through this clear blue sky. And my first thought was, oh, they screwed up that shot. They should have edited the vapor trail out. But then the character looks at it, and he stares at the sky. Oh, because then you, as the audience, follow the character's sight lines. You know, visually you're on the page. You would read the character's motions and thoughts. And that's the thing that creates foreshadowing. Sometimes it's not the mere presence of a thing, it's the character's response to it that becomes significant. You know, with you, Robert, the looking and the dialogue piece.
What the character is directed to, yes. Which again is, as Mike says, is under author's control. You're not just writing out because you want the character to stop and sip and take a drink or look out the window or whatever any of those action beats might be to break up dialogue. The masterful ones do it in a way that is, as Mike said, always progressing, always foreshadowing that the story is unfolding. Some way, shape or form.
Definitely. All right. Did you bring an example, Catherine? All right.
I did not.
Well, then I think we should wrap this up. Any final thoughts or anything else we need to carry on with before we close the show? All right. We'll take the silence as a no. So this has been Foreshadowing redone. I think we got a lot more clarity on it and a lot more depth and insight. So I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, you can come to Facebook, the Storyworks Writers Group, if you want to share your thoughts with us. And please rate and review and subscribe. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.